They handed my 6-year-old a sleeping bag for the hardwood floor while my sister's family slept in the guest room. I didn't argue, I just left. At 11 p.m. and quietly pulled the plug on 12 years of support. My daughter was on her knees on the hardwood, trying to unroll a sleeping bag that kept sliding out from under her, and nobody in that house so much as turned their head to look at her. That's the image I keep coming back to, not the laughing. Not even my mother's voice saying it like it was nothing, you can sleep on the floor, but my 6-year-old in her socks, wrestling with nylon on cold hardwood at 10:30 at night, while my son slept uncovered on the couch 15 feet away, and every adult in that living room kept talking about wine pairings like nothing was happening at all. My sister Denise was on the stairs. She had a glass of Malbec in one hand and the good throw blanket, the one from the guest room, the one that was supposed to be for us, draped over her shoulders like a cape. "You should have booked a hotel," she said, and laughed. Something in me didn't break in that moment. It shifted, like a foundation settling right before it splits, quiet and structural, the kind of thing you don't hear happen until the crack finally reaches the surface. I'm Gwyn. I'm 38 years old. And for 12 years, I had been the only thing holding that family's finances together, while they told each other stories about how I was the lucky one. My father died on a Tuesday in March, 8 years ago, in a hospital room in Kessler Falls with a heart monitor beeping too slowly for anyone in the room to say out loud what it meant. 2 days before that, when he still had the strength to talk, he held my hand and made me promise to take care of my mother and my sister. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was dying and I was 29, and I would have promised him almost anything in that moment. I didn't know then that taking care of them would become a second, invisible, full-time job I'd carry for over a decade, while my sister was never asked to promise anything at all. It started small, $800 a month toward mom's mortgage because her fixed income from dad's pension didn't stretch far enough after the funeral costs. Then it was property taxes, twice a year, because she called in a panic each time the bill came due. Then it was Denise's kids, camp deposits, a set of braces for my nephew Kevin, an emergency that always seemed to land the week before payday. I'm an actuary. I build spreadsheets for a living, and somewhere around year 4, I built one for my own family without really meaning to, just to understand where the money was going. By the time my daughter turned 6, that spreadsheet had a running total at the bottom that I'd stopped showing my husband Marcus because I was embarrassed by it. $183,400. Denise gave nothing back but excuses, and the excuses were always the same shape. A crisis, tears, a wire transfer from me within 48 hours, and then silence until the next crisis. Once she called sobbing about Kevin's medical bills, a possible appendicitis, she said, emergency surgery, insurance denying the claim, and I sent $12,000 in 2 days without asking a single follow-up question, because that's what you do when your sister is crying about your nephew being sick. 3 months later, I saw the granite countertops on Facebook. "So blessed," the caption said, with a photo of Denise's new kitchen island, the light catching the flecked stone just right. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was a coincidence, that the money for the countertops had come from somewhere else, that I was being uncharitable to my own sister for no reason. I've since learned that "I told myself it was nothing" is usually the exact sentence you say right before you find out it was something. There was an earlier version of this same lesson, 3 years before the countertops, that I'd already failed to learn from. Denise's wedding. She and Kevin had picked a venue neither of them could afford. A vineyard 40 minutes outside Kessler Falls with a per-plate cost that made my stomach drop when I saw the invoice she forwarded me, just for reference. 2 weeks before the wedding, she called crying, said the caterer was threatening to cancel over an unpaid balance, said she didn't know what she and Kevin were going to do, said mom couldn't help because mom was already stretched thin. I wired $9,000 to the venue directly, skipping Denise entirely so the money couldn't get absorbed anywhere else first. I told myself it was a wedding gift. I told myself sisters do this for each other. I stood in the back of that vineyard reception in a dress I'd bought on clearance because I'd spent my clothing budget for the year covering someone else's centerpieces, and I watched my mother give a toast to the bride and groom that mentioned, by name, 4 different relatives who'd helped make this day possible: an aunt who'd done the flowers at cost, a cousin who'd let them borrow a car for the honeymoon, a family friend who'd donated the photography. She never mentioned the $9,000. She never mentioned me at all, except to note, almost as an afterthought near the end of the toast, that Gwyn came too, all the way from her busy life, like my attendance was the generous act and not the money that had kept the caterer in the building. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I hadn't given the money to be thanked for it. Both of those things were partly true, and partly the kind of thing you say to yourself so you can keep doing something that's slowly costing you more than you're willing to admit out loud. Every holiday for 12 years, I cooked. The turkey, the sides, the pies, the setup, the cleanup. Denise showed up an hour late with a bag of gas station dinner rolls, ate, and fell asleep on the couch by 7:30 most years. And my mother's line was always the same, delivered like scripture. Let your sister rest. She's had a rough year. 15 rough years running by my count. I stopped counting out loud after the 10th. Last Thanksgiving was the one that finally cracked something open. I hosted, as always, 10 of us at a table set for 6, which meant I spent 3 days before the holiday hunting down 2 extra folding chairs from a neighbor and a card table leaf my father-in-law had stored in his garage since 2009. My daughter got a folding stool at the corner of the table, wedged between the wall and the china cabinet. Denise's youngest got the good chair, the one with armrests, at the head of the table nearest my mother. My mother gave a toast before we ate. She thanked Denise for always bringing such joy into the house. She thanked Kevin for his baseball season. She thanked my brother-in-law for working so hard providing for his family. She did not say my name. She did not say my children's names. Not once, in a toast that ran almost 4 minutes. Denise leaned over to her husband Kevin, not the nephew, the husband. They'd named him the same as his own son, which had confused Christmas cards for a decade, and said, just loud enough for the table to hear, anyone can roast a turkey. Not exactly complicated. Later that night in the car, my daughter asked me from her booster seat, Mommy, why didn't Grandma say our names? I didn't have an answer. I still don't. Not really. What I said was, eat your potatoes, baby. Except she'd already finished her potatoes an hour earlier, so even that fell apart in my mouth before I got it fully out. I tried to fix it, the way I always tried to fix things instead of naming them. I called my mother 2 days after Thanksgiving, ostensibly to ask about leftovers, and worked the conversation sideways until I could say, as lightly as I could manage, I noticed the toast didn't mention the kids, or me. I just wanted to say something so it doesn't happen again. There was a pause on the line long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then my mother said, Gwyn, you're always looking for something to be upset about. I can't win with you. And that was the entire conversation. Not an apology, not even a denial, just a redirection so smooth I found myself 20 minutes later apologizing to her for bringing it up in the first place, the way I'd apologized my way through a dozen conversations just like it over the years. I hung up the phone in my kitchen, put both hands flat on the counter, and stood there for a full minute before I trusted myself to walk back into the living room where my kids were watching cartoons like the world hadn't just quietly rearranged itself again. I didn't bring it up again after that. I told myself I'd chosen my battle and lost, and that some things weren't worth losing my mother over. I didn't yet understand that I wasn't choosing between the relationship and my dignity. I was choosing, every time, to hand over a little more of the second thing to keep a version of the first thing that had already stopped being real years earlier. That brings me back to the sleeping bags. We'd driven 3 hours to Mom's house for her birthday weekend. Her 65th was coming up in 6 months, and I'd already started planning the party. But this particular weekend was just a regular visit, the kind Marcus and I made 4 or 5 times a year to keep the kids close to their grandmother. Denise's family had arrived that same afternoon, unannounced as usual, and by the time we got there at 6, the guest room, queen bed, the good linens, a small nightlight plugged in for Kevin's youngest, already had Denise's suitcases stacked inside it. Nobody asked where we'd be sleeping. Nobody offered an alternative. At 10:15, my mother came into the living room with 2 sleeping bags from the hall closet, the same ones we'd used for a camping trip a decade earlier, one of them still smelling faintly of a campfire from 2014, and set them down on the hardwood floor. You should have booked a hotel, Denise said from the stairs, and laughed, the throw blanket from the guest room still around her shoulders. I looked at my daughter on her knees, trying to make sense of nylon and cold wood. I looked at my son, already asleep on the couch. No blanket, one shoe still on. Nobody was looking at either of them. Nobody had looked at them all night. I turned to Marcus. Get the car seats ready. He didn't ask why. He'd been watching the same room I had. He just went. My mother caught us at the door, sleeping bag still rolled under my arm, both kids half asleep and confused in their coats. You're leaving? Over a sleeping bag? Mom, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. The last time you asked how I was doing, not what I could do for you, how I was Dad's funeral, 8 years ago. Name one other time. She didn't answer. That silence was the most honest thing she'd given me in a decade. I drove 3 hours home in the dark with both kids asleep in the back seat, and somewhere past Newark, at a rest stop off I-78, I sat in the car with the engine running and pulled up the spreadsheet on my laptop while Marcus went in for coffee. 12 years, $183,400. I read the total 4 times, the way you reread a number that's technically always been true, but has never actually felt real until that exact moment. My hands were still cold from the parking lot air, and I remember flexing my fingers over the keyboard because they didn't want to move the way I told them to. Marcus came back with 2 coffees and a hot chocolate for our son, who was still half asleep against the window, and he set my cup in the console without saying anything, the way he does when he can tell I need quiet more than conversation. I looked at the spreadsheet glowing on the screen. 12 years of dates in one column, amounts in the next, a running total at the bottom that had grown so gradually I'd never once felt it grow. The way you don't feel a tide come in until you look down and realize the water's at your knees. I thought about my daughter on the hardwood floor. I thought about the folding stool at Thanksgiving, the toast that ran 4 minutes without her name in it, the granite countertops, the vineyard toast that thanked a cousin's borrowed car before it thanked me. I thought about Dr. Castellano's phrase for it, months before I'd ever meet her. I didn't have that phrase yet, that night in the parking lot, but I had the feeling underneath it, sharp and sudden, like a fever breaking. I made a list. Cancel the mortgage supplement. Cancel the property tax payments. Cancel Mom's 65th birthday party, the one I'd been planning for 6 months, 80 guests, a lakeside venue deposit already paid, gold foil invitations already printed and mailed with the words hosted by Gwyn Yoder at the bottom of each one. Monday morning, I made the calls. I spoke with Renata Alvarez, the events coordinator at Lakeview Terrace, who'd been handling the venue booking with me for months, and sounded genuinely startled when I told her her to process the cancellation. I called the caterer, a small operation called Thistle and Thyme, run by a woman named Carol Petrakis, who'd already ordered half the ingredients. I called the florist. I called the DJ, a guy named Doug Weaver who'd DJ'd my own wedding 9 years earlier, and asked carefully if everything was okay. When you send the cancellation confirmation, I told the bakery, Nadia's Custom Cakes, where I'd put down a deposit on a 3-tier cake in April. Please email it to my mother directly. She should hear it from you. 80 invitations were already sitting on 80 kitchen counters and refrigerators across 3 towns. Every single one said hosted by Gwyn Yoder in gold foil at the bottom. I hadn't thought about that detail when I mailed them. I thought about it a great deal once I started making cancellation calls. Then I logged into my bank's app and canceled the automatic transfer that had run, without interruption, for 144 consecutive months. Never missed. Not once. Not the month my son spent in the NICU at St. Agnes Medical Center and Marcus and I ate rice and canned beans for 3 weeks straight to cover the copays. Not once in 12 years. The app asked if I was sure I wanted to cancel the recurring transfer. I sat with my thumb over the button for maybe 10 seconds. Then I pressed it. I typed one email to my mother. No accusations, nothing dramatic. I'd learned somewhere in the last 12 years that facts land harder than anger ever does. Effective January 1st, I will no longer be supplementing your mortgage or property taxes. I'm giving you 30 days notice, as any responsible arrangement deserves. Quick pause. If you want more stories like this in better quality, my Spotify's linked in the description. I'm also canceling the birthday celebration. The venue, caterer, and bakery will contact you directly regarding the cancellation. I pressed send at 2:47 p.m., sitting in a Wawa parking lot with both kids finally awake and eating pretzels in the back seat like nothing in the world had just changed. By Wednesday, Denise was sending me screenshots of canceled camp registrations with 3 separate exclamation points in every text, demanding to know what I thought I was doing, reminding me that Kevin's summer plans depended on this. I didn't reply to any of them. By Thursday, my mother called. I let it go to voicemail the first 2 times. On the third, I picked up. She started with fury about the party. 80 people, Gwyn, 80 people are going to ask what happened. And then, within about 90 seconds, pivoted straight into guilt, the way she always had, the way I suspect she'd learned to do decades before I was ever born. Your father would be so disappointed in you. He asked me to take care of you, I said. He didn't ask you to put my kids on a floor. She hung up on me. I remember feeling almost nothing when the call ended. Not relief, not grief, just a kind of quiet I hadn't felt in longer than I could easily remember. 10 days later, the town found out because 80 invitations with my name in gold foil don't just quietly disappear. They sit on refrigerators. People started asking my mother why the party had been canceled, and the story she gave each of them didn't line up. A scheduling conflict to one neighbor, a health scare to another, a vague family issue to a third. Ruth Danvers, who'd known my mother from the same church congregation for over 20 years, apparently asked her at the grocery store, point blank, whether I'd been the one paying for everything all along. I found this out because I flew to Chicago for a 2-day work conference. I consult for actuarial firms on pension liability modeling, and this was a client I couldn't reschedule, and kept my phone off through most of both days, the way I always do at conferences because I like the quiet. When I turned it back on Tuesday night in my hotel room, the screen lit up like a slot machine hitting every line at once. 98 missed calls, my mother, Denise, numbers I didn't recognize, a few of mom's church friends, a neighbor I'd met maybe twice, someone whose contact card just said Ruth D., mom's church. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, still in my blazer from the client meeting, and played the last voicemail. My mother's voice, stripped down to almost nothing, no fury left in it at all. Ruth asked me point blank if you were paying for everything. I couldn't lie anymore. Everyone knows. Please, please call me back. I set the phone face down on the nightstand. I looked at the ceiling for a long time. I didn't call her back that night. I called Priya Anand the next morning instead, a certified financial planner I'd been meaning to sit down with for 2 years and kept putting off. Mostly, I think, because some part of me already knew what she'd tell me about the spreadsheet if I ever showed it to a professional. I finally showed it to her. She went quiet for a moment, scrolling through 12 years of transfers, then said carefully, Gwyn, I want to be direct with you. This isn't family support anymore. This has been a financial dependency you were never compensated for and never protected in writing. If your mother or sister ever tried to claim any of this as loans owed to them in reverse, or tried to contest anything in a future estate matter, you'd want documentation of every transfer, dated and itemized, starting now. I hired a family law attorney the following week, Dennis Okafor, 11 years in practice, specializing in elder family financial disputes, mostly to formalize, in writing, exactly what my father's actual wishes had been. It turned out my father's will, which I'd never fully read in detail because grief makes you skim documents you should have studied, contained a clause naming me sole executor and specifying that any financial support I provided my mother was at my daughter's discretion, not her obligation. Dennis read that clause out loud to me over the phone, slowly, twice, like he wanted to make sure it landed. My mother had known about that clause for 8 years. She had never once mentioned it. I also started seeing a therapist that spring, Dr. Miriam Castellano, a licensed clinical psychologist with a practice specializing in family financial abuse, which is apparently its own recognized category, something I hadn't known existed until I needed a name for what had been happening to me for for over a decade. In our 4th session, she asked me a simple question that undid something in my chest I hadn't expected to feel. When your daughter asked why her grandmother didn't say her name, what did you want to tell her? I didn't have an answer that day either. I do now. Priya also connected me with a CPA she'd worked with for years, a soft-spoken man named Harold Weiss who specialized in family gift tax reporting, to make sure I hadn't accidentally created a tax problem for myself on top of everything else. Harold went through the 12 years of transfers line by line over 2 working sessions and confirmed what Priya had already suspected, because I'd never filed a single gift tax return for any of it, staying just under the annual exclusion most years through what he called, not unkindly, a fairly remarkable amount of restraint for someone giving away this much money. He flagged 4 years where the mortgage supplement, plus the property tax payment, plus a camp deposit or emergency transfer had technically crossed the exclusion threshold, meaning I likely should have filed. Nothing criminal, he told me, adjusting his glasses over a printed ledger with sticky tabs marking each flagged year. But it's worth amending going forward, so there's a clean paper trail if anyone ever asks where 12 years of your income went. I remember sitting in his office thinking that even the tax code had more interest in tracking what I'd given than my own mother ever had. Before my mother called, my Aunt Ruth Ann, my father's sister, the one relative who'd stayed mostly neutral over the years, called me directly the day after I landed back from Chicago. She'd heard the whole thing secondhand through the church grapevine and wanted, she said, to hear it from me instead of from Ruth Danvers' version, which by that point had picked up at least 2 details that weren't true, including a rumor that I'd been secretly buying Denise's house out from under her. I told Ruth Ann everything, calmly, the way you tell a story you finally stopped being afraid of, the spreadsheet, the $9,000 at the wedding, the sleeping bags, the folding stool. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that stuck with me longer than almost anything else that month. Your father used to worry about this exact thing. He told me once, a few years before he passed, that he was afraid Denise would let you carry everything and never once look back to see if you were still standing under it. I hadn't known that. I still don't know what to do with knowing it now, except that it made the promise I'd made him at his bedside feel different. Less like an obligation I'd failed, and more like a warning I'd finally caught up to, 8 years late. Denise called me exactly once during that stretch, not to apologize, but to ask flatly whether I'd told everyone about the money on purpose to embarrass her. I told her I hadn't told anyone anything. The invitations had done that on their own, sitting on 80 refrigerators with my name in gold foil, the same way the granite countertops had sat on her Facebook page 3 years earlier without my help. She hung up before I finished the sentence. We haven't spoken since, not because I slammed a door shut, but because neither of us picked the phone back up. My mother eventually called me back 3 weeks after the 98 missed calls, once the calls had stopped and the voicemails had gone quiet, and the town's questions had presumably found some other gossip to move on to. She didn't apologize, not really. She said she was sorry I felt that way, which is the kind of apology that isn't one, dressed up to look like it might be. I told her I loved her. That part was true, and still is. I told her I wasn't coming back to being the family's invisible checking account, and that if she ever wanted a relationship with my children that didn't run through what I could provide, she knew where to find us. At our table, where every chair has armrests and every name gets said out loud. Denise and I haven't spoken since. Her texts stopped once the camp deposits stopped clearing, and she realized shouting into a phone wasn't going to restart an automatic transfer that no longer existed. My mother's mortgage, I later learned through Ruth Ann, went into a modified payment plan with her lender within 4 months of the supplement ending. Not a foreclosure, nothing that dramatic, just a real accounting of what she could and couldn't actually afford on her own, something she'd never had to face in 12 years of my quietly closing the gap for her. I felt something when I heard that. Not triumph, exactly. Closer to the specific, unglamorous relief of finally putting down a weight you didn't realize had been reshaping your spine. I did end up throwing my mother a birthday party that year, just not the one with 80 guests and gold foil invitations. In March, 4 months after the cancellation, I invited her to our house for a quiet dinner. 6 people, our own dining table, real chairs, no folding stool anywhere in sight. She came. She was subdued in a way I'd never seen her be, and at one point during dinner, unprompted, she looked at my daughter and said, "Thank you for having me, sweetheart," using her name. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close to enough to undo 12 years, but it was the first time in longer than I could remember that I'd heard my mother say my daughter's name like it belonged to somebody worth naming, and I let myself have that much, without pretending it was more than it was. My daughter is 7 now. Last month, at our own kitchen table, over spaghetti on a Tuesday that had nothing special about it at all, I told her I loved her, by name, out loud, for no reason except that I meant it, and I wanted her to hear it plainly, the way I'd waited 38 years to hear it myself. She just said, "I know, Mommy," like it was the most obvious thing in the world. It should be. I'm making sure, from here on, that it always is.